18th of January Thursday, -3 degrees Celsius. Cloudy, calm. This day marks a dividing line in the history of the siege of Budapest, the day Pest was abandoned and the battle shifted to the Margit Island and Buda. The defenders, German, and to a lesser extent Hungarian troops, were forced to give up on this day and completely evacuate the eastern part of the capital, Pest, and retreat to the other side of the river, Buda. In a few places, however, the trapped and encircled, isolated defenders on the Pest side held out for days. The Ferenc Joseph Bridge, today Liberty Bridge, had already been blown up by the Germans a few days earlier. On January 16, in order to somewhat slow down the crossing of the Soviet troops across the Danube, the Germans also blew up the still-standing, but previously undermined Chain Bridge and Elizabeth Bridge. As the diary entries also testify, hellish scenes took place, as the two last bridges, already significantly damaged, but still standing, were packed with fleeing families and retreating soldiers. Very few survived when the bridges were blown up and hundreds were thrown into the icy Danube. Moreover, the destruction of the city's symbolic bridges brought little advantage to the defenders, since the Soviet troops had long since surrounded the German and Hungarian army units from the west, on the Buda side as well.
Lux Gyula,
60 years old college teacher. District 12.
Today we learned that the Germans have blown up the Danube bridges. This is the greatest scoundrelism they could have committed, because it has no strategic significance whatsoever, as the Russians have long crossed the Danube. The news was brought by a colleague of mine who serves in a military labor battalion. He said that there is great destruction on the Pest side. Entire rows of houses have burned down. Many houses have collapsed.
János Tolnai,
15 years old. District 12.
Kis János Altábor Nagy Street.
My godmother unexpectedly arrived today. She had been staying with relatives in Pest but was forced to flee from the advancing Russian troops. She recounted how horrific her escape from Pest had been, and it was clear she was still reeling from the tragic events of the morning. The basement dwellers listened in stunned silence as she described how she managed to cross the chain bridge at the last minute, caught in a panicked crowd that nearly trampled each other. Soldiers and civilians alike were only looking out for themselves. The wounded lay groaning on the ground. She herself, holding the hand of one child from a family of 3, stumbled and fell repeatedly as she helped them in the insane escape, while the Russians bombarded the bridge with mortar fire. She described her survival as a miracle she could scarcely believe, even now. Sobbing, she continued her story, telling us how she had barely left the Buda bridgehead and turned into the street when she heard a tremendous explosion behind her. The bridge had blown up, along with the fleeing crowd still on it, thus preventing the Russians from following them to Buda.
Iván Boldizsár, 2nd District. Hidás Street.
In the morning, I went up to see that certain mayor, the one who promoted himself to chief of police. He did it by going out to Pest Headache Kuth, to the Russians. He claimed to have organized a unit of 6,000 to 8,000 men under the German rule. When I asked him what his occupation was, he managed to smile surprisingly kindly and replied, a vagrant.
Déri Tibor,
50 years old writer. District 5, Nador Street.
Like a seriously ill patient, after a crisis, I slept soundly through the night, immersed in a deep slumber. I didn't hear the Germans withdraw from the house, nor the explosions of the bridges. In the morning, Ajli woke me up with the news that they had seen a Russian on the corner of Arani Janos Street. I got up and stood in front of the gate, while Ajli went upstairs to clean the apartment. A second Russian came, then a third. I shook hands with one of them. He said something I didn't understand. After that, I set off towards the Hungarian Hotel. An unusual silence hung over the street, the stillness of a deserted city. I didn't see a single person for the length of the street. Towards the middle of Nador Street, a house had collapsed. The rubble filled the entire roadway, and both sidewalks, a horse's carcass, lay belly up among the bricks. In Verasmata Square, I finally encountered 5 or 6 people. On the corner, in front of the large optician's shop, The bodies of some German soldiers lay on the sidewalk, their limbs already stiff. One body was standing on its head, its legs bent at the knees and leaning against the corner mailbox. As I turned the corner at Vörösmarty Square, the Germans started firing on Pest from Buda. I ran along the houses to the Vadaskurt Hotel and ducked into the doorway. Several people were already standing there. I asked them if they happened to know whether the Hungarian Hotel was still standing. It burned down, they said. And those who lived in it? They shrugged. They didn't know. I ran on, luckily reaching Maria Valeria Street. The Hungarian building was still burning, a thick cloud of smoke rising above it. Here, under the protection of the row of houses on the Danube bank, more people were walking in the street. The first person I asked gave me directions. The residents of the Hungarian had fled to the basement of the house opposite. There was a civilian guard at the entrance. They asked who I was looking for. I didn't dare say my wife's name. I stood and thought, finally naming my brother-in-law. If my wife was alive and heard her brother's name, she would know that I was calling for her and looking for her. We went down to the basement, visiting the relatives one by one. Then my wife and I went out into the street together. The Buda artillery fire had stopped. We walked up and down Váci Street. My wife saw the ruined city for the first time. She burst into tears. "We should have died," she said in despair. Then she threw her arms around my neck again, now laughing loudly in her happiness. Around us, the shops on Váci Street were already being looted. An elegant woman in a Persian lamb coat emerged from the window of the Molnar and Moser drugstore, a large basket on her arm full of soap and perfume bottles. A bar of soap fell to the ground from the basket. My wife, in her happy zeal, picked it up, hurried after the woman, and gave it back to her.